The funeral home was too cold, or maybe that was just me. I stood in the back of the chapel while people filed past my father's casket, offering condolences to Linda, my stepmother of 15 years, and her two biological children, Marcus and Jennifer. Nobody seemed to notice I was there. I'd flown in from Seattle that morning, taken a red-eye after getting the call that Dad had died suddenly of a heart attack. 58 years old. No warning. Just gone. Linda had called me herself, her voice flat and efficient. "Your father passed away last night. The funeral is Friday at 2. I assume you'll want to attend." Then she'd hung up before I could respond, before I could ask questions, before I could process that the man who'd raised me was dead. I hadn't seen Dad in 3 years. Not since Linda had gradually frozen me out of family events, convinced Dad that I was too busy with work to visit, made it clear in 1,000 small ways that I wasn't really part of their family. That I was a remnant of Dad's first marriage, an obligation he'd fulfilled by raising me, but not someone who belonged in his new life. Now I watched strangers console Linda while I stood alone in my ill-fitting black dress, the only funeral-appropriate clothing I owned, feeling like an intruder at my own father's memorial. The service was generic. A minister who'd barely known Dad spoke in platitudes about faith and eternal rest. Linda's children gave eulogies about what a wonderful stepfather he'd been, how he'd embraced them as his own when he married their mother, how blessed they felt to have had him in their lives. Nobody asked me to speak. Nobody acknowledged that Dad had raised a daughter for 18 years before Linda entered the picture. Nobody mentioned that he'd been a single father who'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. It was like those 18 years, the years when it was just Dad and me against the world after Mom died, had been erased. Replaced by the narrative Linda preferred. That Dad's real family was the one he'd built with her, that his real children were Marcus and Jennifer, that I was just a footnote from his first tragic marriage. After the service, people gathered at Linda's house for the reception. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to be there, wanted some connection to my father, even if nobody wanted me there. I arrived late, after most people had already filled plates with catered food and clustered into conversation groups. Linda was holding court in the living room, accepting sympathies and telling stories about Dad that emphasized the last 15 years while conveniently omitting the 23 years before that. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping to remain invisible, when Linda found me. "Natalie, you came." "Of course I came. He was my father." Something flickered across her face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "We need to talk. Privately." She led me to Dad's study, a room I'd helped him organize when he moved into this house. His books were still there, but everything else had been changed. His desk replaced, his photos removed. No trace of the man I'd known. Linda closed the door and turned to face me, her expression cold. "I'll be direct. I don't want you making a scene today." "This is hard enough without you trying to insert yourself into a family you were never really part of." "Excuse me?" "You know what I mean. Your father married your mother young. You were born because that's what people did back then when there was an accidental pregnancy. But he never wanted to be a father. He told me that. He said raising you alone after your mother died was the hardest thing he ever did, but he felt obligated." The words hit like physical blows. "That's not true." "It is true. He was relieved when you went away to college, finally free of the burden of raising someone else's child." "Someone else's child? I was his daughter." "Were you, though?" Linda's smile was cruel. "I mean, really? Because, Natalie, I've seen the timeline. Your mother got pregnant 3 months into dating your father. Shotgun wedding, baby 6 months later. Do the math." I felt the world tilt. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father had doubts." "Serious doubts about whether you were actually his biological child, but he was too honorable to question it, too decent to ask for a paternity test after your mother died. So he raised you anyway, even though he was never sure you were his." "You're lying." "Am I? Why do you think he was so distant these last few years? Why do you think he let me push you out of family events without fighting for you?" Because, Natalie, deep down, he knew. He knew you weren't really his. And once he had Marcus and Jennifer, his actual children, he didn't need to pretend anymore. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room was spinning. "So here's what's going to happen," Linda continued in that same cold, efficient voice. "You're going to leave this reception quietly. You're going to stay away from the will reading. You're not going to contest anything or make claims on your father's estate, because you were never his real child, Natalie. You were just a responsibility he fulfilled out of obligation to a dead woman, and now that obligation is over." I walked out of that house in a daze, got in my rental car and drove to a hotel, not trusting myself to go back to Dad's funeral reception, not sure I could face any of those people knowing what Linda had said. Was it true? Had Dad really doubted I was his? Had he raised me out of obligation rather than love? I thought about our relationship, how close we'd been when I was young, how distant we'd become after Linda. I'd always blamed her for pushing us apart. But what if it was more than that? What if he'd wanted distance because looking at me reminded him that I might not be his? I cried in that hotel room for hours. Cried for my father, for our relationship, for the possibility that everything I'd believed about being loved was a lie. 3 days later, I got a call from Harold Berkowitz, a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize. "Ms. Natalie Foster?" "Yes." "I'm calling about your father's estate. I need you to come to my office for the will reading, Friday at 10 a.m. I thought Linda said, whatever Mrs. Foster said. I have explicit instructions from your father that you be present for the reading of his will. Can you make it? Yes. I'm still in town. Good. See you Friday. Linda had told me to stay away from the will reading, but Dad's lawyer was insisting I attend. I didn't know what that meant, but I showed up Friday morning to a downtown law office, my stomach in knots. Linda was already there, along with Marcus and Jennifer. They looked surprised to see me. What is she doing here? Linda demanded. Ms. Foster was specifically requested by Mr. Foster, Berkowitz said calmly. Shall we begin? He read through the standard legal language, then got to the actual provisions. The house went to Linda along with half the savings. Marcus and Jennifer each received $50,000. And to me, to my daughter Natalie Foster, I leave the remaining half of my savings, approximately $200,000, my entire book collection, and the contents of Safety Deposit Box 447 at First National Bank. I also include this letter to be read aloud in the presence of all parties. Berkowitz opened an envelope and began reading in my father's handwriting. To my family, if you're hearing this, I'm gone, and there are things I need to say that I didn't have the courage to say while living. Linda, I loved you, but over the years I watched you systematically push my daughter out of our lives. You made Natalie feel unwelcome in her own father's home. You convinced me that she was too busy to visit when really you just didn't want her there. You told me I was being too sentimental about the past, that I needed to focus on our family, meaning you and your children. I was weak. I let it happen. I let you create a narrative where Natalie was some obligation from my past, rather than my beloved daughter. And I will regret that weakness for whatever comes after this life. Marcus and Jennifer, you are good kids, and I was happy to be a stepfather to you. But you need to know something. Natalie was my daughter first. She was the little girl I raised alone after her mother died. She was the one I read bedtime stories to, taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, supported through college. That bond is something neither of you can understand because you came into my life as teenagers, already formed, already with a father. And Natalie, my sweet girl, I need you to know something that Linda has probably already told you. She found some old letters from your mother last year. Letters written while your mother was pregnant. Letters that mentioned she'd been seeing someone else before we met. Linda became convinced that you weren't my biological child. She confronted me with this evidence and demanded we do a paternity test. She said it would finally prove that you weren't really mine, that I could stop pretending, that we could move on as a real family without the burden of my first marriage's daughter. I refused. I told Linda that I didn't need a test because I already knew the truth. You are my daughter. Not because of DNA, but because I raised you, because I loved you. Because those 18 years when it was just you and me were the most important years of my life. But Linda wouldn't let it go. She kept pushing, kept suggesting you weren't mine, kept creating distance between us. And I was too weak to fight her effectively. too conflict-averse to tell her to stop, too worried about my marriage to defend you the way you deserved. So 3 months ago, I did something without telling Linda. I did a paternity test. Not because I doubted you were mine. I never doubted that in any way that mattered. But because I wanted proof to shut Linda up forever. The results are in Safety Deposit Box 447, along with your mother's jewelry and some other items I want you to have. The bank manager has instructions to let only you access it. Natalie, whatever those results say, know this. You are my daughter. You always have been. You always will be. And I'm sorry I let Linda make you doubt that. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger in defending our relationship. I'm sorry for every missed visit, every holiday you spent alone, every time you felt pushed out of my life. You were never a burden. You were never an obligation. You were my little girl, and I loved you more than I had words to express. I'm leaving you half my savings because I want you to be secure. I'm leaving you my books because I remember how we used to read together, how you'd curl up in my lap with whatever novel I was working through. I'm leaving you those memories because they're the most valuable things I own. And I'm leaving you the truth in that safety deposit box, whatever it may be. I love you, Natalie. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for us. Your father? David Foster. The office was completely silent. Linda's face had gone from shocked to pale to something like panic. Marcus and Jennifer were staring at their mother, and I was crying so hard I could barely breathe. The safety deposit box key is here, Berkowitz said, handing me a small envelope. The bank is 3 blocks away. They're expecting you. I stood on shaking legs. Linda started to say something, but I held up my hand. Don't say anything to me ever again. You tried to make me believe my father didn't love me. You tried to convince me I was never his real child. You spent 15 years pushing me out of his life, and then you used my mother's memory as a weapon to hurt me at his funeral. I was just trying to protect my family. I was his family. I was his daughter before you ever met him, and you couldn't stand that. So you spent 15 years trying to erase me. I looked at Marcus and Jennifer. Your mother is a manipulative person who spent years destroying my relationship with my father. I hope you figure that out before she does the same to you. Then I walked out of that office and headed straight to First National Bank. The bank manager, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, greeted me with sympathy in her eyes. Ms. Foster, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man. He came in 3 months ago to arrange this box specifically for you. She led me to a private room and brought out the safety deposit box. Inside were several items: my mother's wedding ring and jewelry, old photos of Mom and Dad and me as a baby, and a sealed envelope labeled Paternity Test Results for Natalie only. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter from a genetic testing company dated 3 months earlier. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. David Foster is the biological father of Natalie Foster. I started laughing and crying at the same time. The relief was overwhelming. Not because I doubted, I hadn't, not really, not in any way that mattered, but because Linda had planted that seed of uncertainty, had tried to make me believe I wasn't really Dad's, had used it as a weapon to justify pushing me out, and Dad had known. He'd gotten the test to prove it, to leave me evidence that Linda was lying, to make sure I knew the truth even after he was gone. There was another note in his handwriting. Natalie, I knew this would come back showing I'm your father. I've never doubted it. But I wanted you to have scientific proof because I knew Linda would try to use this against you after I died. She's been telling me for a year that you're not mine, trying to convince me to cut you out of my life completely, to leave everything to her and her children. I've been pretending to consider it while actually arranging to protect you. The $200,000 is more than Linda thinks I have. I've been moving money into a separate account she doesn't know about. Money from investments and my retirement fund. It's all yours now. Use it well. Live a good life. Be happy. And remember that being someone's real child has nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with love. You were always mine. Always. Dad. I sat in that bank room for a long time, holding my mother's jewelry and reading my father's final words to me, understanding finally that he'd been fighting for me in ways I hadn't known, that he'd been protecting me even when I thought he'd abandoned me, that Linda's poison had infected our relationship but hadn't destroyed his love. 6 months later, I received a certified letter from Linda's lawyer. She was contesting the will, claiming that Dad had been unduly influenced or mentally incompetent when he'd arranged his affairs. It went nowhere. The bank records showed Dad had been systematically moving money for over a year. The lawyer confirmed Dad had been completely competent. The paternity test proved Linda's entire narrative was false, and Dad's letter made his intentions crystal clear. Linda lost. The court upheld the will in its entirety. I kept the $200,000, the books, my mother's jewelry, and most importantly, the proof that my father had loved me until the end. Marcus reached out about a year after the funeral. "I'm sorry," he said, "about everything, about Mom, about how she treated you. I didn't fully understand until after Dad died and I saw the paperwork. She really did try to erase you." "Yeah, she did. For what it's worth, Dad talked about you, when Mom wasn't around. He'd tell stories about teaching you to fish, about your graduation, about how proud he was of you. He loved you, Natalie. Mom just made it hard for him to show it." I know that now. Jennifer never reached out. I heard through Marcus that she'd sided with Linda completely, convinced that I'd somehow manipulated Dad. That was fine. I didn't need her understanding. What I needed, I already had. Proof that my father loved me, that I was his real child in every way that mattered, that the distance between us in his final years was Linda's creation, not his choice. At my dad's funeral, my stepmom said I was never his real child. that he'd raised me out of obligation, that he doubted I was his, that I didn't belong in his family. But then the DNA test arrived, 99.97% probability of paternity. Along with a letter explaining that Dad had gotten the test specifically to prove Linda wrong, to leave me evidence of her lies, to make sure I knew the truth even after he was gone. I was his real child. I always had been. Not because of DNA, though that was nice to have confirmed, but because he'd chosen to be my father every single day for 18 years, and he'd continued choosing it even when Linda made that choice difficult. Linda had tried to steal that from me. Had tried to rewrite history, to make me doubt my father's love, to convince me I was never really his. But Dad had left me the truth, and the truth was simple. I was his daughter. He was my father. And love, real, deep, chosen love, was stronger than Linda's poison. I still have that DNA test in a frame on my wall. Not because I need the scientific proof, but because it represents something bigger. My father's final act of protection, his final gift, his final way of saying, "You are mine, and no one can take that away from you." At my dad's funeral, my stepmom said I wasn't his real child. She was wrong, and Dad made sure I'd know that forever.